Hey everyone, welcome to Strategic Analytics for Museums. Can you all hear me in the back? A little closer? I'm going to have to pull it tight. The gain, it's a quiet mic. Welcome to our session. We're excited to share with you some of the conversations that we've been having amongst the four of us in grouped efforts and separate efforts over the last year or more, and to share our thinking through this. This is a sector-wide movement, and we want to talk about what we're thinking in terms of analytics and how we're thinking of that in a big picture way. But it's a sector-wide movement in a really nascent place right now. And so some of the pieces that we've been thinking about, we want to put some structure around so that we can articulate where our goals are and the roadmap that we're going to use in order to get there. We believe that strategic analytics is both a campaign and a set of implementation activities, and it's going to take a long process for most of our institution to get there. Next slide, please. Do I have the clicker? No. There we go.
Right, so the question becomes, what are analytics in a museum? How does it begin to be relevant to you, and what does it actually encompass? And what we try and do is recognize that it's not just what the typical view that we have, which is Google Analytics for the website, but rather there's a lot of different systems across your organization that's collecting data and information. Could be your business systems doing ticketing, doing group sales and reservations, could be school groups, could be also individual interactives that you have in galleries that are collecting data about how they're being used, what buttons are being touched on screen, what different content areas are being addressed, and then of course also mobile and other handheld forms of also collecting similar data to Google Analytics. And so essentially what you're looking at is kind of how do you take the aggregate of all of these things and begin to sift through those things, not as individual silos, which individual business units within an organization are used to doing, but rather what's the cohesive view of that, how do you make it work across your organization, and how do you tie those individual things together? So one of the projects that I was involved in a couple of years ago was with the Dallas Museum of Art called the Friends Program. And essentially it was a loyalty program. We were trying to begin to track visitors. And we recognized that rather than saying just let's do the traditional bits of data analysis and collection that are done in museums, that we wanted to directly query what visitors were doing and how they're expressing their own interest to us across the organization. And so we see this as kind of as we begin to look at that behavioral pattern of visitors and what they're doing in our galleries and in the different exhibition areas that we have, that is kind of a change point for us, right? It's not just a simple passive collection of information, look at reports that are generated out of systems, but instead that we have to look at the broad spectrum of these things and really begin to build in the tools that allow us to make decisions with that data. So at some point you're looking, certainly in terms of technology, you're looking at personalization, loyalty, things like that, but it begins to give you behavioral elements across the range of what visitors are doing in the museum.
So why? In the end, it's a really enormous effort to put through analytics in a more strategic fashion, to marry your evaluation capabilities with your business data, with your on-the-floor interactives and the back-end data there. Why would you go through so much effort in order to put this together? And my piece there is that good data is addictive. Good data helps you make decisions going forward. Years ago, many years ago, dating myself now, when the Holocaust Museum opened and I was first doing audience research there, we were this new museum on the Mall in DC, under a lot of pressure to talk about who our visitors were and what our analytics were, and we had very little data. We even struggled to count the number of visitors going through the door and who was a visitor and who was not a visitor. And over time, during those months, I was able to build a series of analytics more or less by hand, grabbing data from one department, getting people to give me their hand tallies and putting it into access databases. By the end of that process, I could type in a congressional district, a state, and come out with a report that would tell us exactly who had been there, how many teachers had we trained, what were the school groups that had come through within that congressional district, so that we could go to the Hill and say, yes, you might be in Montana, but our museum in Washington has an impact on your constituents and what is happening in your communities, and that's why we need your support nationally. And that data and that analysis became incredibly addictive for our leadership going forward. In terms of of what we're able to do now, we're able to do that in a much more powerful way. What the data that I had back then was primarily on visitors and their origin and a little bit about who they were. Now we have information that we can marry from the business pieces, from the digital side, what they're doing on the floor in an automated fashion, and how our exhibits feed back in terms of these pieces.
So we want to follow a technique that we do in the movies frequently, where you get a little bit of an intro, and then we go to the title credits. And so we realized that we should actually tell you who we are, and we're going to pause here for a moment to kind of do that with some dramatic effect. Now, especially that I've called out attention to it. I'm Bruce Wyman. I'm a consultant for the museum field. I've been doing stuff across a variety of different museums over the last 25 years, ranging from technology projects to larger level strategy stuff to stuff. I do a lot of weird stuff. I build museums on occasion as well.
I'm Hegley Goldman. I've started as a researcher and evaluator and look at how we move from evaluation to strategy. I'm an independent in the field.
Corey Timpson. I'm the Vice President of Exhibitions, Research and Design at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights.
I'm Douglas Hegley, the Director of Media and Technology at the Minneapolis Institute of Art.
And then music swells to a crescendo and we go back to the story in progress. So one of the things that we have is we wanted to try and point out with the chart on the right on the slide there is that there are different pockets of use of these kinds of data. And typically, when we mentioned having it be siloed earlier on, that there's a realization that you probably use it in those individual areas, but even then there are overlapping bits of activity. And so you look at some level of business analysis, of external reporting needs. In some cases, like for CMHR, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, there's a detailed level of provincial statistics that need to be reported, as well as the national, essentially the federal level. And many other museums go through that same sort of thing. Douglas, I'm sure that in Minneapolis you'll go through what's the impact that the museum has on the economy of the region, right? And that's a very common set of data that you get. In terms of exhibition design, there's always the typical, are our exhibitions actually being effective? It's not just necessarily time and tracking. Where do people spend time in an exhibit? Where do they go? But also, what's the effect and impact of the stories to which they're paying attention to? And then, of course, that always informs a level of digital development that's being done across your organization about how do you improve the stuff that you have? If you're going to do an interactive, what do you do next? Because you want to make sure you're actually servicing the needs of your visitors, and they're not always good about just telling you what they want. So you've got to collect information about what that's going to be, and then be smart about analyzing it.
So this quote is a preface to where Bruce and I argue when we're working together on how to look at data. And the part that we agree about, which is the important part at the end of the day, is how we are drowning in input at this point in time, right? We have more data. You can look at Google Analytics for weeks and weeks and weeks and still not necessarily come up with actionable, reportable pieces to go forward. And so the quote on the screen right now is an E.O. Wilson quote about drowning in information but yet starving for wisdom. And part of the genesis of this particular piece is how do we sort through the data that we have, make it work better together, and then how do we move forward into the phase of interpretation? And we feel like we're not quite at that phase yet, interpretation.
Yeah, so the thing that and this has been true in these conferences for probably the last decade now, we as a field struggled with how do you collect all that data, right? And we were actually dealt with do you do infrared counters at the door? Do you have people with individual clickers? Do you begin to do a lot of individual evaluation and testing and that sort of stuff? And we always believed that the premise was that collecting enough data was hard, right? And that was the real nut that we needed to crack. And once that fell into place, then we'd have stuff that we could actually do and it would be interesting and engaging. And the reality of that, as we have found ways to collect that data, and DMA Friends was a good example where over the course of about a year and a half, we had about 95,000 people involved in it. We had a couple million rows of data about the use of the museum. It turns out at that point, you find out the really hard part is understanding the data. Actually collecting it, pretty straightforward, but actually doing something useful with it, understanding what it means and asking that question, that's the real nut to crack. And so, we think there's kind of this point of where the perception of what was easy has actually been minimized, and that the real effort over the next 5, 10, 15 years in the field is how do you analyze that data? How do you synthesize it? How do you ask the right questions? How do you even know that the questions that you've asked are the ones that you intended to ask in the first place?
And the point of disagreement between Bruce and I is that I've always felt like it is easier to collect the data, and that that data is out there, and that the analysis and interpretation is the piece that is underplayed. At least once a year, I get a call from someone asking me to write a grant with them to make my job redundant, where they will be able to automatically analyze and interpret the data so that they will know what this information means. And while we step through that dance together, eventually my analogy is something along the lines from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And for those of you that are old enough to remember this piece, where you built a giant machine to answer the question for life, the universe, and everything, and you get out the number 42. And so the evaluator's job traditionally has been then to tell you whether 42 is a good number. Do other planets have the number 42? Are we doing well? What should we do with that number going forward? So the data itself is 42, and what we have to do after that, whether that's building another giant planet or mainly boning up on our analysis and interpretation skills to know what to go forward, that's the real struggle. And then there's the issue of big data. So that's the other call I get every year, is how can we apply to big data philosophy to what we're doing in museums? And the slide here is comparing big data versus medium data, right? And so realistically, let's be honest with ourselves. Museums do not have big data, and we're unlikely to ever get big data, right? And big data is residing in massive databases of institutions and social media constructs, all of these different places that have far more queries than we will ever have as an institution. What we have is medium-sized data, and medium-sized data will take a different set of analytical techniques, it will take a different set of core assumptions about what we're looking at, and most importantly, it will take a willingness to acknowledge and deal with the pieces of missing data and the assumptions that we have that we will not ever be able to fit in, right? We will not ever be able to fill in those pieces. And that's okay, but it requires us having a different mindset about what we're able to do about the predictive capability of our visitors. When we give them RFID tags, when we track them through an institution, there is only so much knowledge that we will ever get to, and that remaining mile, we're gonna have to make some assumptions. So it's important for us to question our core assumptions and talk about them as we go forward.
Yeah, one of the reasons that while Kate and I could certainly ramble on for well over the entire hour that we have, we thought it was important to actually bring real museums that have actually done some of this work to the table or are in the progress of doing the work. So the point of having Douglas and Corey here is they're the whipping children for what does this actually mean in a museum, because they have some real life experience. So Douglas, I guess given that, what's it like at MIA?
So I am going to talk a little bit about the sort of business case. Like, what problem are we actually trying to solve? Next slide. We have this striking capacity to undervalue fact and overvalue the tiny little data points that actually support the point of view that we already had. This is called confirmation bias, and it leads us to make foolish decisions. Next slide.
Yeah, the thing I'd add to that is anybody who has a conversation with me, I'll have an argument and I'll frequently say, and I decided this n equals 1, so I'm right.
The confirmation of Bruce. We also think that we're data-driven already because we do surveys. Well, let's think a little bit about doing surveys. These example questions have been homogenized a little bit, hopefully to protect the guilty, but they're all based on real questions asked in museum surveys. The problem here, of course, is that in each case, the likelihood of getting a meaningful or valid answer back is compromised by specific problems in the structure of the question. And I'm not even focusing here on other problems about surveys, such as sampling error, acquiescence bias, which is our tendency as human beings to try to make people happy and answer questions in a way that they think they want us to answer them, and the limitations of aggregate data. This somehow idea that if you make an average, it then applies to everyone, which is kind of the opposite of how that works. Nobody's really average, right? Next. The other problem is spurious correlations, and if you've never visited the blog of spurious correlations, you need to go there at some point today. Here's something that proves that it's your fault that Disneyland Paris is in trouble, because we have an almost perfect correlation between you having less good experiences in your life and visitation at Disneyland Paris. Will you please have some more good experiences and save Disneyland Paris? This isn't causation, folks. It's a spurious correlation. Next slide. So what we need to do ultimately, and what we're up to at MIA, our challenge is to move from a long history of doing things our way, based on tradition, bias, compelling anecdotes, which are the major culprits in confirmation bias, and of course waiting for the hippo to weigh in, right? The highest paid person's opinion. We need to move from hippo to geek. Next slide. And that will depend on developing confidence in the data. Our future vision is that we rely on that data first to trigger some very specific automated actions, that's data-driven, and also to inform our most important decisions, something like exhibition planning or fundraising, using a disciplined practice of data analysis, and officially that's a practice called statistics. You know that class that we all did poorly in college. Next slide.
So completely different examples, but then taking Bruce and Kate's methodology and applying it. The Canadian Museum for Human Rights, we opened less than 2 years ago, so we're still doing a lot of things for the very first time. And when we thought about the project and we started to conceptualize and work our way through developing a new museum and opening it from the ground up, we realized that there was just a lot of potential, but we always thought of the sort of the project and then the operations, like this 2-phase process, when in fact there's really at least 3 phases, and maybe there's even a 4th phase that we're so naive that we don't know about yet. But the project ended and we're operating, but we're still doing a lot of these things for the first time. We're very reactive, we're not all that proactive, and we have a lot of opportunity in front of us to change our methodology, or actually adapt our methodology. So I consider us in transition phase, from having staff who are on terms that are going to expire to developing our own and understanding our own needs and then developing our responses to those needs. So we're in this transition phase and we've basically through the project phase, we did a critical mass of everything that we would need to do to be sort of rich enough. But the critical mass is only so deep because we needed to get open. We made a lot of strategic compromises along the way so that we would open, but it's important now that we are actually responsive and strategic about how we deal with what we're doing. So we see the landscape in front of us and we can do anything. We have a lot of ambition, but we can't get bogged down in the fact that we can do anything. We have to just actually do something. So applying the methodology and getting buy-in across the organization is really interesting because there's all of these competing demands. And a lot of people will say that I work with, well, we've done a lot of evaluation. Look at the iterative design process that we worked on over the years. We did front end, we did formative evaluation in the development of our content and exhibitions. We really did employ an iterative design process over a number of years to get where we were at. Then we did these heuristic analyses, and we produced volumes and volumes and volumes of data on what our results were and how we got to where we are. But to Bruce and Kate's point earlier, the interpretation of these volumes of data is kind of what's lacking. So we have these great intentions right now. And we're a national museum, but we're situated in a province, in a city. And one of our big challenges going forward is how do we ensure that we address a national audience, yet respect our local audience, and how do we balance this idea of national engagement and the fact that we want to be an important part of the local community. We want to ensure that we have a strong visitor engagement, obviously like any institution. And that with our subject matter being human rights, there's a lot of stakeholder groups that have different opinions. Our subject matter can contradict itself, like the right to information, the right to privacy, how do those play together? So engaging visitors within this context is really important, and it can't just be driven by corporate initiative or the board's intention or even management intention. We really have to understand what it is that our visitors and our audience is looking for. We want to evolve smartly, because we did just open, but we're never going to be a static institution. Our subject matter is too contemporary and too dynamic, but we can totally lose credibility if we don't evolve in the right way. We want to be sustainable like every institution, and we all know that relevance is like the key word right now. And so what integrated and strategic analytics can do for us is help us build relevance across these 4 sectors, if you will. Relevance to our visitors, that they're having the experience that is helping, they're having a meaningful experience, we'll say. management, that we're not sitting around the management table looking down at our own belly buttons, that we're really making informed decisions, that we can report back to our board and our governance structure and manage that relationship based on data and facts. And then we get our federal appropriation. We get money from the feds in order to be a federal nonprofit. And we can build a better case with them. We can manage that relationship a lot more if it's not just about the sort of imperatives that we're coming up with. So how this is starting to translate into what we're doing now is we're developing our strategic plan sort of for the very first time. We had a lot of strategic plans leading up to the opening of the museum, but now we actually, we can't say that we've been open for almost 2 years. And the strategic analytics can really help us develop a coherent strategic plan. So we develop critical success factors, goal areas, strategies, and KPIs. The integrated analytics and strategic analytics that we're doing with Bruce and Kate are really helping us bring actual meaning to the strategic planning process that then goes out to all of our constituencies. But I wanted to focus on this one goal area of our strategic plan, which is the visitor experience, and this idea of development of a visitor impact score. We are literally going to try and do this. Come up with that one number that means something, and I've been coming to MCN since 2002. I don't know how many times I've kind of heard this. I'm not sure if it's just blind naivety or just ego, but we're actually going to try and do this. But to Kate's point, we'll see if it works or not, but it's not going to be the number that matters. It's going to be that how it is that we support that number and the meaning of that number and what it is, how it's interpreted and then applied over a period of time. So, look forward to our next session when we actually tell you how that worked or didn't.
But in the meantime, we'll start to talk about the framework and the process that we've been thinking through as Bruce and I have been working with Corey at this point, and then talking to Douglas about his own process in pulling this together for these two institutions. It's all great to talk about, we're going to be more strategic, we're going to be more data-driven, we're going to have a more rigorous piece at going at this, but how do you ever get from here to there, right? And then, and thinking that through, we've had to, among us, invent this. What are the next steps? What are the implications for this? Because there are workflow implications, there are job responsibility implications, there are staffing implications, and how you put your budget towards things. So when we first started at CMHR, we were going through a discovery process, and what do you have in back end? What do you have in visitor data? What do you have in business operations data? And at the same time, we were coming at it from the other end. What is our goal? How do we want to have this integrated? And what are the characteristics of the things that we're looking at? And because we were modeling from big data, we understand that we're medium data, but we're modeling from big data. We wanted to look at the frameworks and how big data is organized and what those attributes that are important, so that we can think about the attributes of the type of data, the type of process we need going forward. So Bruce is going to cover some about our thoughts on big data before we go forward into how we apply that into the institution.
Yeah, right. I mean, the reality there is that we recognize that while we don't have a big data problem, that there's a learning experience to have there. And so as we've gone through some of the work with both Corey and Douglas, the realization is, what does the organization need to understand about data in the first place? What are the qualities of that? And so typically when you have big data discussions, there's a discussion of 5 Vs. These are the 5 Vs. And they apply to the different kinds of data. And the thing you need to recognize is as you begin to look at the continuum of data that you have to make decisions, that you have different components of these different elements. And it's not that you need to have all of them for each piece of data, but you need to recognize that if you're going to make a certain kind of decision, that some elements of these come into play. There are a set of 5 slides here, so as I see everybody trying to jot down all 5 before I move on to the next slide, I'm going to warn you, that's okay, you're going to be stuck on these for a few minutes. First one is about volume, recognizing that sometimes you just have a lot of volume of data. There's just a ton of stuff and you've got to be able to sift through it. But in comparison, the big data that places like Facebook begin to deal with are 350 million pictures updated per day, right? So when you have your Instagram feed and you're getting stuff from Twitter and you're getting a few hundred a day, your problem is very much different. You don't need to scale in the same sort of way. Amazon sells nearly 14 million items a day, and Google's doing 3.5 billion searches a day. That's big data. That's a lot of stuff. What you have is kind of a walk in the park, even though it feels monolithic at this point as you begin to sift through it. At the same time, you want to recognize that for having good data decisions, you need variety to them. You want a diverse spectrum of things because you need to be able to compare and contrast. And even for being able to look at some of the things like the spurious correlations that Douglas had mentioned, you need to be able to validate assumptions across other forms of data to make sure that the assumptions you're making, the decisions that you're seeing, the trends that you think that you see are actually validated by other things. So the more variety you have in the data, the better off you are at the end of the day. You need to be aware at the speed at which these things appear, the velocity of data. There are things that you get every day. For example, you have daily sales metrics of the ticketing and attendance sort of things. But you may in the galleries have individual interactives that are giving you data about every button press that's going on during the day. The thing you need to ask yourself before you invest in that infrastructure to have that, do you need that every day? Do you need that kind of velocity? Or is it just that if you get like a monthly tally of that sort of stuff, that's okay, in which case that has a dramatic impact on the workflow that you'll design around that chunk of data about how the interactives are being used in the gallery. At the same time, and this is probably the biggest nut, is veracity of the data. How good is that data? What kind of noise is there? For example, with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, there is all the experiences are bilingual. You can do it in both English and French. So one of the things naturally that's being tracked is how often the different languages are being selected. And yet at some point when you see that data and you recognize it doesn't actually, because we've looked at the variety of data, it doesn't match the attendance of what we expect those language selections to be, you realize, oh, the noise that's being captured in that data is people either trying out the interface or experimenting with the moment before going back to a different language or just seeing what happens, right? There's noise in that data and it becomes very difficult and takes discipline and time in order to be able to sift through that the real signal is in that information aside from the noise. And then finally, the value of that data. For example, I'm not going to come up with any example. Oh, yes, right. The value of the data that you collect is critical. And again, I'm going to beat on CMHR. Our classic example.
That's why we're here.
Our classic example is that CMHR has a visitor satisfaction score that's being collected through surveys. And they have done generally pretty well. You have rated favorably on this arbitrary metric of 0 to, I don't know, 5 or something like that. But the dilemma in that is it's a museum of human rights. And some of the stories are difficult and hard. And we don't know what the satisfaction actually measures, right? So in some cases, we've looked at the way some of it's being structured. It becomes clear like, oh, the parking experience was good and buying tickets was good, which has nothing to do with the content or material. And frankly, if at the end of the day, if you've said like, I found this experience about human rights very satisfying, we're not sure if it's because you like kind of the horror stories of what people can do to each other, or you found the uplifting elements that CMHR reveals and the personal efficacy that you can do. We don't know if that's actually what's being measured. So the value of that data, while it sounds good on the surface of it, is highly suspect. So the reality is the CMHR is doing terribly, no, that's.
So I'm going to, this is simply to set us up into the next examples that we're really in the startup phase of this, and that it's broken and awkward in terms of moving through our analytics, right? We know what we have available at places like CMHR, and we're starting to figure out how we need those pieces to talk to each other, and then we have an enormous task in actually transitioning to the point where not only do we have the systems integrated, but that we have the workflow integrated before we can see the full impact here. I'm going to turn it over to, I think Douglas is next to start to talk about his systems.
This extremely ugly slide shows you that we're probably in the early part of transition. We have a full enterprise CRM up, as you can see in the middle of this flow chart. It's called Salesforce, and I hope you'll memorize everything on this chart because it will all change by next month. We're in the middle of making all of this incredibly complex machine function because the goal here for us to collect, I guess it's only medium data. I thought it was big data, but it's only medium. Okay, is for us to reconcile numerous museum software platforms, all of which were designed to run independently and not talk to other systems. So as we build out, sometimes internally, through blood, sweat, and tears, our own API infrastructure, our own ways of synchronizing data, as we ignite and celebrate and dance around the burning servers of crappy old museum software and get up into cloud-based services, we know we can move in this direction. Sometimes it feels a little bit like Sisyphus. You know, we're kind of just never seem to get up to that top of the hill and the work is really hard. But a lot of our strategic plan depends on being successful here. I'll talk about that in a few minutes.
One thing I'd add to that is this is a tough nut to crack, right? And this is the problem that every museum typically will go through, is that you have all these siloed systems. And so the thing I would say, if there are vendors of business systems in the room, tessitura, you want to begin to make sure that you can integrate those systems across different things and make it easy for people to get the data out of those systems that they want.
And in terms of, I thought, I'd throw this slide up because this is our landscape. And 4,700 square meters, about 50,000 square feet of mixed media exhibition space. And each one of these products, from tangible interfaces to mixed media environments to kiosks to films and digital signage, straight into our mobile app. We have 300 iBeacons around the exhibition space, to all of our social channels. Bruce alluded, some of them there are 2 channels per, so 2 Facebook pages, because one's in French, one's in English. Point of sales, ticketing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We are able to capture just reams of data. Bruce was really instrumentally involved in the development of the exhibitions and ensuring integration of a lot of these systems together. But our opportunity is enormous. So I think, unlike Kate's example of when the Holocaust Museum opened, we have tons of potential to capture data. But again, we're in this startup to transition. Next slide. And so we're capturing a lot. We set ourselves up to capture a lot, but we're not using much. And we're not really interpreting very much. And what I'm most concerned about when we start, and why we most sort of need this model, is bias is really starting to creep in. So because we're capturing a lot of data and it's not being well interpreted, people are sort of using it to push their own agendas around the museum. And so, I sit at the executive committee, and there are 3 other vice presidents, a chief financial officer, and a CEO. And we have these conversations about how we're going to spend our resources, what's going to get our attention. And I can see the same data used by 2 different vice presidents to push sort of 2 different angles on something. And maybe neither one of them are wrong or neither one of them are right, but this is just, it's all on us that we have to do something to sort of start to get this bias out and start sort of looking at the same numbers in the same way. Yep. So, we need to prioritize as well. Back to that, we've only been open for 2 years. We're doing a lot of things for the first time. And what are the top priorities that get our attention? I'm going to use an example. We developed a series of films, and one of our films is sort of on human rights history in Canada. And, so I was the executive producer on this film, and a large number of my team were on it, and we hate this film. This film was just, we tried to do too much. Anyone who's worked on the film is the first thing we do is we replace that film. Well, we do at least visitor feedback compiled every Friday. It comes out, the entire executive team sees the feedback. We've had 600,000 people through the museum. How many people have complained about the film? 0. But has no one complained? And then we're like, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't. But has no one complained because everyone just can't be bothered to watch this film and then they just move on to something else? Or has no one complained because they actually love the film? Or, what is the actual story? And so as we're trying to prioritize all of these things and where we're going to spend our money and our people, this is going to be really critical for us. Also, we have such a media-rich exhibition program that we have a lot of capital assets invested, and they're going to depreciate. And do we evolve and replace what's there, or do we evolve and just replace what's there in terms of hardware, or do we look at replacing the exhibit itself within the exhibition? So all of these decisions are sort of coming up, and being a new institution, we still have this opportunity to get ahead and lay the foundation for a good, strong methodology that will help us do this. And then the reporting I sort of got to earlier about appropriation, but also sponsorship. We're expected to generate revenue as well as our federal appropriation, and we have really compelling stories, and we want to tell those stories in really interesting ways, but there's a lot of the story that can be told through the strategic analytics if we can manage that properly and sort of help support our stories as we're going to sponsors and philanthropic donors and looking to sort of create that relevance again.
So I hope we've outlined the whys of why we want to do this and the problems that we're wrestling with and our acknowledgement that this is a long journey to take. We've also tried to outline some of the attributes of useful data. While big data is not the type of thing that we're relying on within this, we know that those attributes about how much data we have, the value of that data, the veracity of that data, all things that we have to keep in mind when we're starting to integrate some of these systems. Now, we also have to talk about the different stages that any one piece of information moves through the system in order to make it useful. We know that the values of those data, the 5 V's, are sort of the qualities of what makes it useful, but we don't know how it gets from being this customer satisfaction on the floor or the feedback pieces in order to being useful. So we've taken what are the stages essentially of evaluation and blown them out to a larger framework of analytics, right? And in evaluation, if you're doing it right, there should be these same 8 stages, and applying them to analytics makes quite a bit of sense. And in the first stage, you have to make choices about what you want to know about satisfaction or value or relevance, which is our big question, and make those choices something that are specific and actionable enough. Say, this is our critical focus at the moment. You have to collect that data. You have to clean that data. You might have to integrate that data with other pieces of data, right? That information. So we've looked at relevance, but we're missing key attributes in the people that come to our public programs who actually have a very different connection to relevance of the institution than our visitors who walk in the door on the day-to-day basis. You have to analyze it and you have to interpret it, and I'll take an evaluator stance here that those are 2 different things, right? And that the analysis of a piece of information is simply moving it through statistical pieces, right? We might say this is statistically significant. This is not a statistically significant change. We put these in coding categories so we can understand visitor motivation. The human part, the harder part after analysis, is actually the interpretation. Okay, we know that there's no statistically significant difference here. We've figured out that we have more pleasure seekers coming than hobbyist seekers coming to these particular type of programs. We have to interpret what that means. Did our marketing go wrong? Are we marketing in the right spaces? Should we change the day of the week? That's all the interpretive layer after the analysis. And then if we're doing it right, we're disseminating. And when I say disseminating here, I mean within the institution. Do the right people within each of your institutions have the information they need in an interpretable manner and in a timely manner in order to make the next stage of decisions? And I went through like the next 7 slides in detail. So when we were doing this with Corey, that talks about their choices in KPRs and that these needs of these individual departments might not overlap. So his business operations people have very different needs from the visitor services people, from the shop. All of these sorts of membership have different needs, and some of those reporting needs are outside the organization. So you have these provincial needs that he was talking about and these federal needs to report back. Collection, as you saw, we've been doing collection across different types of pieces. So how often does that membership data come? Can we marry it with the evaluation data? Not right now, but there should be ways that we can ask the right questions across our different formats in order to have more interoperable analysis. Cleaning, as I said, cleaning is so underrated. It's typically by hand and not automated. And when you ask data scientists, the studies out there, how much time they spend cleaning, it can be 90% of a data scientist's time to clean the data, and that the actual analysis and using that data is much less of the job than we think. And it's a hard hand-based piece. Integrating is the hardest thing that we're working on right now. How can we integrate some of the evaluation data with the business systems data? Analysis, I'm going to leave that one alone and go on to interpretation. And interpretation is something that has to come within the field. It has to come within your peers. You can't know what 42 means unless you know the domain of expertise that you're working with. You have to know your peer institutions, and you have to know your own goals and values and hold that really strongly and interpret through that lens. Is it important to us that we're having a certain constituency in our public program? programs, that our membership sales are reaching a certain area within families, and that those values of the institution have to be very evident within the institution. And it's very context sensitive. What we might be able to push towards Corey would be very different than one of his other VPs and what they need to know. Dissemination, we find, happens so sporadically and informally within the institutions that I have worked with. This can be the sharing of a report at an all-staff meeting, but most often it is the hallway conversations that someone finds out that someone knows something about the institution that they do not. And then decision-making. We all talk about it, but we have very poor examples of where actually information on the ground, not anecdotes, lead to decision-making within our institutions. This final slide shows these 8 steps. Now the next one. Bruce and I's very rough weight of amount of effort that they take from each point throughout the process, right? And so hopefully most institutions have those choices. They're already discussing their strategic plan. They've made their decisions about where they are putting their effort and their values, for better or worse, and they have been able to articulate that. And then we talk about the collection a lot, but really, as I said, it's the cleaning, the integration, and the interpretation that takes much more time and effort within this, and tend to be the areas that institutions underestimate. And then in the end, we're hoping to make a bigger push towards decision making. This has implications for how we organize our institutions.
Yeah, that's very much a thinking ahead to individual bits of workflow, right? Because as part of any of this analytic effort, that you've got to recognize that multiple people will be involved, or multiple people are going to play different roles, and each of those different chunks takes real time and effort, right? We want to be mindful of that. And so at the same time, we begin to look at what are some of the idealized roles and responsibilities that make this sort of thing possible, right? And it's not that necessarily that you have a single person that's doing this, but these are roles that may become part of positions over time, or become the responsibilities of people. And we think, and this is also that came out of discussions with Douglas early on, that there are probably 3 major pockets of work that needs to happen in some form in your organization. There's evaluation, there's the technical side, and the analysis side, right? And so the evaluation ends up kind of actually doing the work of measuring impacts and outcomes of that sort of stuff, deciding what the instruments are that are going to be used to do the evaluation of that stuff, and that the right kind of data is being collected. They also train staff and educate staff. They explain what all of this stuff is, and they are the champion for doing this sort of data analytical work in the first place. The analysis is subtly different, right? They're the people that are doing the actual data collection. They go through the statistical work of it. They do the effort of making sure that what you see is maybe a number represented on a dashboard, that there's meaning and thought behind that, and then also pivot and say, not just this moment in time, but rather the trend that we see over the next couple of months, or what's happened over the last year, and doing that in a way that produces it in a way that's compelling and informative, and actually leads to the conclusions of what the data is trying to say, not what just seems like the simple numbers, such as a visitor satisfaction score. And then finally, the technical side can't be underrated, right? There's got to be somebody that can do SQL queries into a database, that understands that hodgepodge of spaghetti mess of different systems that Douglas showed, that was made purposely obfuscated of extra effort, that there's somebody that can look at that and say, oh, that looks beautiful to me. I understand that. I see they're Neo in the Matrix and see the flow of zeros and ones behind the structure behind all of that. Those seem like relatively straightforward things, and it's that triumvirate of effort that allows you to actually get to a much, much better spot. So, Douglas, having said that and used you as a whipping child for a moment.
Sure. I want to just circle back for 1 second on those 8 steps,
yes,
which appear linear, but the truth is we are devoting time to every single one of those steps right now. So I think that's the sort of transition period. And when you get into full implementation, then you're much more focused on the tail end of that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I would say is that the first time you do it, incredibly hard, and you're going to screw it up many times. This becomes more streamlined over time, and especially as you find some of those critical points to fall into place, right? And that's really what that iterative effort gets to.
Well, actually, I'm hoping that all of my screwing it up will inform these people, and they'll screw it up a lot less and streamline it.
They'll find their own special ways to screw it up, Douglas.
Excellent. Good. And we'll talk about it next year.
Yeah.
So we thought we'd be much farther along, and when we were planning this session several months ago, I thought I'd come here and report on the sort of amazing success of our implementation of CRM at MIA. Best laid plans. Next slide. The truth is, we don't know our customers. We're free general admission. Last year we had 756,000 pairs of feet come through the museum. I don't know who they are. And if I don't know who they are, how can I actually provide personalized experience for them? And how do I actually deliver on the mission of the institution? Next slide. Because really for us, using this data is not because I'm in love with data. I'm trying to deliver mission-based and strategic-based objectives. Next. So for us, we're trying to move from simply not knowing who people are. We know that we have some members, and when they apply a discount to a ticket purchase, we know, well, we actually don't even know if they actually came. So we have some real issues here. As we move through this current strategic plan, which ends in 2021, we want to flip the narrative on that. Next. Because as we move from just getting people to know about us and to be attracted to us by the cool things we do, we want them to begin to sort of develop first an attachment to the organization and eventually allegiance or loyalty. This diagram is in our current strategic plan. It's adapted from something called the psychological continuum model. It comes out of sports psychology, where they're trying to figure out why some people become rabid fans of teams that are historically unsuccessful. Right? Sort of an interesting flip on that paradigm a couple of nights ago. Next slide. This also sort of illustrates our current strategic plan, how we're delivering on the mission by really thinking about relationships and communities rather than seeing a sort of big picture of our collection on the screen. Next. We believe that people will put value in the concept of personalization, that because we are a relatively trusted cultural institution, they will opt in, they will be willing to share data with us in a way that we, hopefully never in any creepy manner, actually deliver back to them recognition of who they are, demonstrate that we know them, and deliver personal, rather than that 40,000 emails that say, "Dear fill in the blank, have you heard about our exciting exhibition?" We want to be delivering communications through the channels people like, that they respond to, and in ways that really narrow down, moving away from segmentation to personalization. Next. I know you're skeptical, right? We can't really do this, can we? Well, stay tuned. That's what we're working on. Next. Yeah. Because we are going to collect a lot of stuff, and here's a sort of non-comprehensive list, but ultimately it's who are these people, what are they doing, and what are they saying about us? We'll continue to do surveys, but we won't rely on them entirely. Next. The challenge is getting our institution to have confidence in the data. And I was talking at breakfast this morning with some folks who are talking about data and metrics, about how if you put yourself in the chair of a museum director, you've been getting a lot of BS data for your entire career, right? Visitation numbers are kind of made up. The finances are kind of what we say to the public, but I really know they're not exactly. We're not in as much trouble as the CFO says. I know that the sort of, our donations are up from last year, but I know why. Like, you're getting a lot of BS and a lot of sort of twisted information. So how can we begin collecting real data and then present that in a way to the executives, next slide, that make sure that they understand that this is real data. We're not trying to, this isn't like now the technology department is coming with their BS data. Like, this is the real stuff we want to do. We'll start relatively small and iterate on that as we move along and learn better communication channels with that. Try to build on some early successes where we can leverage some things. And Kate, you're sort of asking for an example. We've done some really rough and dirty sort of net promoter score stuff on the floor in the lines waiting for exhibitions. We've been able to activate mobile crowd-busting ticketing platforms because NPS was going down an hour ago. So you can actually do this when you're recording. Next slide. Data is only the beginning. Our goal is not to have data, right? It's to be a more effective organization, plain and simple, and number crunching in order to do that. Bonus points to whoever got the joke about data down there in the corner. Next. Here is our current evolution of the staffing model, the ideal staffing model that Kate and Bruce have been talking about. So we've hired a couple of folks. We have a certified Salesforce administrator. She's actually in the Salesforce MVP program. She's expensive. I don't know how long I can hang on to her, but she's really dynamic and amazing. She's our sort of wrangler, right? She's the one on top of the data. We've hired a statistician fresh out of college, but we actually have a statistician on the staff of an art museum. I'm not sure that that's a common thing. They've begun to work together. We have a position posted to come in and really work on how we communicate back out through all of those personalized channels. And we're pending, as we do some other sort of juggling of positions, to hire an evaluator who we will probably send off to Kate for a week to really learn some of the methods, who will come in and actually help us design the instruments and do the measuring in our institution. This combination of talents, we think, will help us be very successful this way.
Can I break in, Douglas, for a
Sure.
Because I think this is one of the most exciting slides in terms of what we've been talking about, partially because it shows that this responsibility for strategic analytics doesn't reside with one person, nor does it reside with one department, right?
Right.
These are individuals that have to work cross-disciplinary across different departments, and they may have different ways they touch the data at different times. Some of them might be responsible for analysis of one set of data, but collection of another, or simply another might be responsible for dissemination, and it has to be a very integrated process in terms of I get this, I handle it in this way, and I pass it to you across different platforms, because you're not hiring a single person with a single role that solves this for your institution, which
Totally
I think
agree.
very interesting.
Totally agree. Next slide. These are just, where we sort of are, and we're continuing to press the case and move forward as quickly as we can. Stay tuned. We'll keep talking about it.
Sort of the same thing. I mean, we're actually looking forward to learning a lot from Douglas and what they end up having success on as we mature a little bit more. But just the idea of case making, we all know it's important. And for a while I was talking about this with my peers, my colleagues, and our teams. How we needed to do this, the development of our museum evaluation program for the long term, and the strategic analytics. And people would recognize that yes, that would be super valuable and very important, but really have a hard time understanding why. It'd be like, oh, so you agree? Yeah, why do you agree? Crickets. And just because people get that it's important, but don't really understand necessarily how to explain to themselves or to their teams why it's important. That was a really unique, sort of scenario to go through. Sort of to the last slide that we saw, our resourcing, we still, I keep pushing that we're in this opportunistic scenario and that we don't have a lot of legacy and that we're doing a lot of things for the first time. So we have the opportunity to develop our workflows and our assigned task development so that we do have a federated approach of responsibility across the organization, so that maybe it all funnels up and reports through one sector, one department. In our case, it's the corporate secretariat. There's no sort of program bias that can be introduced, but the sort of approach and all of the tasks that have to lead up into that can be federated across the entire institution in different departments, and that's exactly what we're sort of working on right now. And then there's like sort of a shared accountability, but that there's an accountability structure in place. But we are able to work it into our strategic plan, as you saw the slide earlier, break that down into our departmental plans and then into individual performance plans, so that federated approach of responsibilities and task completion is actually feeding its way up hierarchically into the organization, into individuals' plans, department plans, and then the organizational plans. And then this required both sort of a champion in terms of like sort of me saying we really need to do this, but and sort of a top-down approach and sort of insisting that we would do it. But it also required an organic approach from sort of bottom up. We needed our departments to really think about like what was relevant to them and how they were doing this, and then they would want to chase those down. But then the top-down approach would be like, well, let's see this as a part of a larger picture and how do we pull it together. So there was both the champion in the institution to sort of push the agenda forward, but there was really a lot of organic growth and people working together to sort of force its way up in importance. And those had both opportunities and issues, but I think that's just kind of what we're learning as we go through it.
And we have taken all the time to try and explain.
Sorry.
Trying to explain why we're going there, why it's important, a little bit about our process and how we're getting there, and that it has real world implications, and in terms of our hiring, in terms of our software integration. We would be happy to take one or two questions, knowing that you all are anxious to go to lunch and stick around afterwards.
Yes.
With respect to visitor engagement, you guys mind TripAdvisor, Yelp, Google reviews, where you're getting all that great data for free that they're voluntarily giving?
Yeah, it depends on the organization, right? Because at some point, we've certainly in practices, we've done stuff even beyond just these two areas that individual organizations use some signal out of that, right? There's no reason that the only data that's good data is the data you collect yourself, right? There are plenty of public sources, and if there are things that you want to draw aggregate from and recognize that they may or may have some issues, then yeah, absolutely you want to begin to take advantage of it.
I think the hardest thing is what we would like to do is tie those reviews to an individual and deal with the individual. So right now that's a little bit difficult to do. You take them in aggregate and you utilize them in some way. This is one of our challenges.
Yeah, it's a broad view, right? I mean, that's the distinction to make there.
And to develop a consistent institutional framework for how you look at those views, a clear lens, right? So we know that this tends to be weighted in the direction of these individuals. So when we in a group look at this, we have some sense of how we want to interpret. Otherwise, you get what Corey is talking about, where it becomes anecdotal, and each department can use it to push their own needs based on that data. So it's a shared vantage point on that context.
You know, can I follow up just on that comment too? One reason to have a statistician on staff, I consider it I'm the executive sponsor of this effort. It's my job to teach the leadership team what statistics are.
Yep.
Because statistics aren't, that hill of beans appears taller than that other hill of beans. Obviously now we know the perfect answer, right?
Yep.
Statistics is a disciplined practice that probably none of us understand. I need to learn just enough of it to communicate to the executives. Well, Kate understands it. Excellent.
Any other questions?
Crystal clear.
Excellent. Have a delicious afternoon. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.